Well, good morning, everybody. We're looking forward to a great time today in our gathering, both online and in our micro gatherings. As we get rolling today, I wanted to celebrate some new things. I want to celebrate some new connections that we've been able to make online. Some of you have just recently joined our church in the past week, 2 weeks, the last month, and you're just starting to get connected. We want to let you know how thrilled we are about that and how much we're looking forward to getting to know you and helping you get more connected here moving forward. I also want to celebrate our new micro gatherings. Micro gatherings are smaller groups of people meeting in homes for an interactive time of worship and relationships centered on Jesus. We've had 16 different micro gatherings meeting across our region just in the last 7 weeks. And we've seen several new micro gatherings just get started in the past week or two. So for all of you that are opening your home to host a micro gathering, I want to say thank you. Thank you for providing space for God to work in some incredible ways in everything that we're seeing in and through our micro gatherings in this season. You know, really our heart in wanting to launch micro gatherings was to rearrange things intentionally to think through, okay, what can we do together that we can't do separate? And really in coming together, we want it to be an encouraging time, a relational time, a refreshing time where we are built up as the body of Christ. So that's why we've redesigned our online gatherings to facilitate much more interaction, because it's through that interaction that relationships begin to be cultivated and relationships produce community that lasts far beyond 1 hour together per week. You know, when you think about our lives, everything that happens on purpose and for a purpose. Nothing is accidental and nothing is wasted in God's plan. So, whatever micro gathering you might find yourself in today, you're there on purpose for a purpose, because you need the other people in the room and they need you too. You know, I think one of the lessons that we've learned in this season is that it's really easy for us to take things for granted. And things that we used to think of as automatic or normal in our lives were very quickly turned upside down and ripped away from us. You know, I think it's easy to take relationships for granted. I think it's easy to take the ability to meet together in large or small groups for granted. I think it's even easy for us to take the Bible for granted. And I think sometimes what happens is we can go into this mode of operation where we're simply operating out of spiritual muscle memory. We're drawing back on things that we've learned in the past, but there's not a whole lot of new and fresh things. Maybe you're just focusing in on the classic, the popular, the well-known Bible verses, and maybe there's some other things that you haven't dug into as much lately. Recently, I ran across some verses in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 that I hadn't seen in a long time. And as I read these verses, I thought about how applicable it is to this cultural moment that we find ourselves in, and specifically what God has called our church into in this season. Let me read to you from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and what is written here. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, starting in verse 9, reminds us of the gospel, the good news of Jesus. Gives us this foundation. For God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ, who died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. Therefore, in light of the gospel, encourage one another and build one another up just as you are doing. Our church is gospel-centered. That's our number one core value. And standing on the foundation, the good news of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we are now called to live gospel-centered lives and form gospel-centered community. So really what I want to do as we start out our micro gathering today is I want to live out what we just saw in that passage. In light of the gospel, encourage one another and build one another up. And here's how I want you to do that. I want you to go around the room in your micro gathering, and I want you to take some time with each person. And with each person, have everybody else in the room very quickly, maybe in one sentence, 2 sentences, quickly share, why are you thankful that that person's there? Let them know why you're thankful that they're there. And let's start out today encouraging one another, building one another up as we prepare our hearts to worship our God and continue to follow him together.
is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all.
When darkness seems to hide His face, I rest on His unchanging grace. In envy high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Through the storm, He is Lord, Lord of all.
Everybody, thanks for joining us this Sunday morning here at Restored Church. Welcome. If you are a guest, if this is your first time joining us and you want some more info, you can text us at 570-354-0846 and we'll get back to you soon. If you're in a micro gathering right now, if you're sitting in someone's living room, thank you for doing that. If you're interested in joining one of those or hosting one of those, you can find the information for that at restoredchurch.org/micro, and we'll get in touch with you about that too. Also, during the week, we have our community groups meeting. We love community here at Restored Church. We talk about it all the time. If you're interested in joining one of our community groups, go to restoredchurch.org/join. Speaking of community, we talk about that a lot here. Like I said, if you're in a micro gathering, talk about this in your micro gathering or comment online. How is God using community in your spiritual life during this challenging time?
Well, in a couple different places in the Gospels, we see this encounter of Jesus in the temple where Jesus is very passionate about something. And Jesus says that my Father's house shall be called a house of prayer. And I'm often challenged as I read that because I wonder, how much can that be said of us? Can we say, as the church, we operate as a house of prayer when we gather together? Well, we're not meeting in one large house of worship right now, but we've got houses all across our region that are meeting in micro gatherings. And I would love, wherever you're at, whatever house you're tuning in from, if we could take this time and turn those houses into a house of prayer. You know, the reality is that all of us carry a pretty heavy amount of stress and pressure, anxiety, and angst into a gathering like this. Maybe you're pretty beaten down from the week. Maybe you're stressed out about the week ahead. Maybe you just feel like you have this looming cloud hanging over your life right now. Recently, I've been learning from an author named John Eldredge, and John Eldredge talks about praying a very simple prayer. Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. And see, in doing that, what we're doing is we are learning to release things from the tight grip that we normally hold them with and to release them to Jesus. I think oftentimes you and I are carrying things that we were never meant to carry. So as we start to prepare our hearts for the message today, I would love for us to take some time, wherever we're at, pray that prayer, Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. But rather than just praying that generically, I'd like us to pray that specifically. Jesus, I give Joe to you. Jesus, I give my job to you. Jesus, I give my family stress to you. Jesus, I give my worry about my car troubles to you. And so I'd love, in your micro gathering or wherever you're tuning in from online, just go around and just pray one sentence prayers, getting really specific. Who are the people and the things that you need to give to Jesus? And pray that prayer, Jesus, I give everything and everyone to you, and get specific about what that is for where you find yourself today.
Hey guys, welcome to Restored Church. My name is Wayne Morgan, for those of you who I haven't met. And this morning we're going to be jumping into 1 Peter chapter 2. But before we do that this morning, I want to ask you a question. Have you ever felt like you didn't fit in? Actually, Tim and I had an experience a little while ago. Take a second and check out what we had to endure.
Hey, devil been thinking I lost. No, Jesus drip, I got the sauce. Whoa, send the hate flying, no cross. Bow, move it to the side like a slide show.
So it's pretty obvious that Tim and I will not be professional dancers for the rest of our lives, but it is a fun time to hang out with the teenagers from our church, and hopefully we're TikTok famous someplace. But have you ever felt like you didn't fit in? It was pretty obvious that Tim and I did not fit into that whole schedule of things. This morning, Peter is writing to a group of people, and he's actually urging them not to go back, not to fit back in. And so if you have your Bibles, turn with me to 1 Peter chapter 2. When we think about Peter not fitting in, it would have been something that he was really familiar with, right? Like, don't forget who Peter was. Peter grew up as a fisherman, probably an outcast in his community, not somebody that you grew up wanting to become was a fisherman. It was an inherited business, and that was something that people would have avoided because those people were a little bit smelly, a little bit rough, not somebody that you really would have wanted to associate with. The other thing we see is that Peter was a disciple. Now, although being asked to be one of Jesus' followers was a special honor, he quickly found out that he was at odds with the other religious leaders that were in the religious community. This person that he decided to follow was in and of himself outside of the religious norm. And then in that crowd of people, Peter was, well, Peter. Like he was an outsider even within the disciple community itself. And then when I'm thinking about Peter, one thing that I don't think that we can divorce from this whole conversation is that Peter is the man who denied Jesus. He would have been a couple yards away from Jesus in the middle of his trial, and in that time he denies Jesus 3 times, fulfilling prophecy. And this man would have known what it was like to be an outsider even with his best friend. When we see this, I think it's really, really important that we understand that Peter understands what it's like to be an outsider, and he's encouraging the people who are following Jesus, who are under exile, the Jewish believers, don't find a way to fit back in with the people who you once walked away from. Tim talked about it last week in verses 9 and 10. He says, "But you are not like you once were. You are a chosen people, royal priest, a holy nation, God's very own possession. As a result, you show others the goodness of God, for he has called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Do not go back. Don't fit in." Like Peter is encouraging people, it's okay to be different. Now, when I talk about this with teenagers, I always want to pause. I want to pump the brakes here a little bit, and I want you to realize it's okay to be different, but it's not okay to be weird, all right? So like this isn't, hey, we want you to be really, really, really bizarre in order to get people's attention for God. That's not what Peter is encouraging right here. A lot of the time when we are desiring to be weird, it's to show attention to ourselves, right? It's to point all of the spotlight on us. But Peter is encouraging the early church. He's saying, you understand what it's like to be far from God, but you've been grafted in, you've been pulled into this new way of thinking. Please, please don't go back. Peter actually battled that himself. He was called by Jesus. He followed Jesus for 3 years. He denies Jesus, and at the end of Mark, we find that Peter is out fishing once again. He wanted to go back. In this season of COVID, some of you have been tempted to go back. Maybe it's to go back to a sinful way of living. Maybe it's to go back to what we had before COVID. We're just like, hey, we want to go back, but the reality is God's been trying to get your attention about something. He's been trying to reach through the turmoil and the strife, and he wants to show you something new about himself. And so he's saying, don't go back. And I think this is very applicable to our lives here in our current situation. Don't go back. You see, Peter's writing this to a group of people. He's not writing this out of his own volition. There was a reason behind it. I think for the readers of 1 Peter, there were Jewish Christians. See, the Jews, they were persecuting the Christians. The Jewish faith in and of itself was a safe faith to practice in. There was no persecution in it. There was little persecution. There was a high level of security. Maybe he was telling this to these people because they were tempted to walk away from Jesus because of the persecution and just go back to what was normal. It's interesting that as we read First Peter chapter 2 verse 10, he says, you had no identity as a people, and now you are God's people. You did not have mercy, and now you have mercy. He's like, you've understood what redemption is. Please don't go back. You've been rescued. This isn't the only time he makes this mention throughout 1 Peter. If you have during this week, go ahead and read through 1 Peter and see how many times that he encourages people not to go back, not to depart from the faith. Here's where in verse 11 he says, "Dear friends, I warn you as temporary residents and foreigners," it's in the New Living Translation, "to keep away from the worldly desires that wage war against your very souls." He says you're a rescued people, but in this passage right here, he is actually referring back to Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23. You see, Peter is writing specifically to a Jewish group of people, reminding them that Jesus was the one who rescued them and not to go back to the old way of living. And he says in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 23, not a passage you probably are familiar with, but he says, but God says to his people, the land must never be sold on a permanent basis. For the land belongs to me. You are only foreigners and tenants and farmers working for me. You see, God is telling his people, don't get comfortable all the way back in the Old Testament. But see, what we start doing is we start having in our own lives this desire for security and for comfort. And when we start doing that, it changes our perspective. A few years ago, I had run several backpacking trips for groups of guys. It was part of the youth ministry I was involved with, and every time we did a backpacking outing, somebody would always come over prepared. Have you ever gone on a backpacking trip? This kid came with cans and cans and cans of sardines. And I wish I could tell you that I liked sardines, but I'd never tried sardines up until this point. This kid had a bag, it was a little over 45 pounds. It was filled with water. It was filled with sardines. And I told him at the beginning that this is a really heavy pack. I'm not sure you're going to be able to carry it. And the other adult leaders on the trip said, you know what, if he gets into the struggle, we'll grab a hold of it for him. And so we decided that we would go ahead and keep going with this backpacking outing, but we knew that we were going to have a little bit of extra work on our hands. And so we were a couple miles in. The backpack had literally gone through all of the leaders. And the oldest guy on the trip had the backpack for a little while, and he said, all right, at this point in time, I don't care who likes sardines. We're all having sardines right now because we got to get rid of them right here and right now. Because he didn't come for a temporary passage journey. What he came for was to settle in. You see, I believe what Peter is encouraging the early church to do is he's saying that we should not consider this world our purpose. This world is our passage, it's not our purpose. And for so many of us, we have adopted this idea that this place is our purpose. We start finding our identity in the temporary. And as a result, we're putting all of our effort and all of our focus in the wrong place. You see, 1 Peter chapter 11, or 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 says, "Dear friends," in the New Living Translation, he says, "I warn you, I urge you," he says in other translations, "as a temporary resident, as a foreigner, or as someone who is a stranger." The word in the original literally means somebody who does not have the rights to own property. And so he's telling the people of that were once a part of established churches who are now spread across the world because of the persecution. He's saying, don't go back and trying to get your life all figured out and placing all of your eggs in the basket of being comfortable, of being permanent. We are just traveling through. You see, it reminds me of the phrase, when you know who you are, then you will know what to do. You know, we are aliens and strangers as Jesus followers on this planet. If you're watching right now and you are not a Jesus follower, this might seem very, very bizarre to you. But the reality for us in Jesus, we recognize that if this world is all there is to offer, we feel like this is not our home. And Jesus, in talking to one of the religious leaders, he said, "For God so loved the world that whoever should believe in me should not perish but have eternal life." And so for those of us who follow Jesus, we recognize that the 70 years that we have here on earth isn't the end of us, but this is just a small blip on the broad eternal spectrum that we were created for. And so Peter is encouraging the people. He's going, don't lock yourself into a spot where you think all of what you're doing here on earth is permanent. And I started thinking about some differences, right? When you start thinking about that, going back to the backpacking illustration, when you are backpacking and you know it's temporary, you carry light. You know, you don't travel with a lot of stuff. You go for it, right? When you're temporary, when you're doing a hiking trip, you have a destination in mind, right? You haven't arrived. You are in pursuit of that destination. One thing that's really cool whenever we've gone backpacking is you meet friends along the way, and there's this incredible camaraderie and this incredible love on the trail. Another thing that we see is on the trail is that people are willing to serve one another and people are willing to help out, you know, because we're all travelers in this journey. And I started to think about how different that was from the idea of being in a permanent situation. You see, when you're permanent, you build up and you store up instead of traveling light. When we're permanent, what we start to do is instead of going for it, we only do what's safe. One other thing we do is because we've built things up, we seek to protect them. We seek to defend them. And a lot of the time, instead of reaching out and branching out, we are very, very, very cautious, and we control who we allow into our lives because we're not sure if they're going to take advantage of our wealth. We're not generous. We protect. And another thing, that when we have a permanent perspective, we are constantly saving for the what ifs instead of using what we need in the moment. You see, a prepper might be pretty good on the trail for a little while, but if you carried all of the things that are in a prepper's house, it would be impossible to go on a hike. The Apostle Peter is telling his people that we cannot lock our ideas into the idea that we are here as permanent people. The Jews did that. And in doing so, they set up structure, they set up control, and they missed who Jesus was as a result. I think as I'm thinking about the differences between temporary and permanent, I think it exposes some soul issues too, right? Those are some indicators of permanent versus temporary, but I think the soul issues for the permanent are control, security, and as a result, we actually have a low priority for relationship. I think the soul issues for temporary, instead of having control, there's a surrender element. I think for when you're in a temporary perspective, instead of having security, you just seek to trust, and there's faith there. I think that those who are having a temporary perspective often live with high connectivity with people around them instead of low. I saw this when I worked at the rescue mission. I was amazed at how much those who had nothing were willing to trust people who are constantly reaching out in relationship. And I felt like, as somebody that had a lot, and I didn't realize how wealthy I was until I started working at the rescue mission, I started to recognize some of these differences in perspective. They truly see themselves as temporary residents. So am I advocating for us to go ahead and sell everything we can and live in tents all over? I'm not saying that. I think that there's a good way and a safe way and a Jesus following way that we can go ahead and we can live as foreigners in our world and have a hands open perspective. And I think that's what Peter is encouraging the people in this book right here. He says, one of the ways that we need to do it is we need to step away from the worldly desires that wage war against our very souls. We've got to remember, and I love this quote, that sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. When we adopt a mindset of permanence, we can invest our identity in the temporary. This is really what youth ministry is built out of, right? Like, all of us have this wealth. All of us in the United States have a security because we have a home, and we have all of these resources around us. And even the most poor person in the United States is really wealthy as far as history is concerned, and according to the world itself. And just think about this. When you were a teenager, you probably invested a lot in the style of your day, right? Yeah, the 70s. Remember what the 70s looked like? Yeah, there's elements of it that have come back. But if you invested your identity in the 70s style and haven't updated, people are going to be like, what's up with that, right? For some of you, you have invested in materialism, right? Like you have gone all in. You've put your worldly desires ahead of being a temporary resident, and all of your identity was built in a car. So every new offering that comes out as from the automobile makers, you have to get it because that's part of your identity. For some of you, you have really, really shallow relationships because all that your relationships are built on is fun, right? If we have a temporary understanding of identity, instead of going deep in care and concern and exposing our weaknesses, a temporary mentality will only be concerned about having fun and only what somebody else can do for us. See, without even recognizing it, if we start adopting some of these mindsets that we are just inundated with in our current culture, it will kill our soul. It'd be like if you start loading up your backpack with things that are just way too heavy that will never allow you to get to the place that you are designed to get to. You see, this world is not your it's your passage. It's not your purpose. God has designed you to find purpose through this passage, but you will not find that if you are constantly feeding the desires of yourself. I have a very practical application for this. A couple of weeks ago, I woke up with a start in the middle of the night with my heart racing. I don't experience anxiety much at all, but I just woke up and I felt like my mind was racing, and I started crying out to God and started praying. I was like, God, please remove this anxiety from me. God, I don't know what's going on. And this whisper came back, well, stop drinking an entire pot of coffee during the day. And you might be like, well, wait, what are you talking about there, Wayne? My temporary perspective, my identity, I'm a coffee guy, right? Like, this is something that is very practical. And sometimes when we think about the things, the worldly desires that wage war against our souls, we think about drinking and smoking and those really, really big sins. But there are things in all of our lives that are slowly eating away at who we are. They're capturing our attention more than they need to be. They're locking our perspective on something other than Jesus and making our perspective focus on something very temporary. Maybe you're a mom and you're just so in love with how young and how little your child is. And you're focused on that temporary perspective, not recognizing that that little baby that you're holding, your job is to raise that person to be a competent adult. We can slowly let our worldly desires eat away at our souls. And when that child grows up, you will feel this emptiness and this longingness that you shouldn't feel because you placed your identity in something that was temporary. For some of us, it's the job, right? Like, we've placed our identity in the temporary, and this weirdness with COVID makes us wonder if our jobs are even secure. And so it's eating away at our soul. Maybe some of us have gone into some extreme amount of debt because we have to keep up with the rest of the world. We have to do X, Y, and Z. And that worldly desire is waging war against our souls. Peter is saying, hold up one second. Do not invest in the temporary. Now that we've got this reset and being persecuted, do not go back to who you once were before this. He says God's trying to get your attention. In verse 12, he says, be careful to live properly among your unbelieving neighbors. Then, even if they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your honorable behavior, and they will give honor to God when he judges the world. This is a pretty interesting idea here. The New Living Translation actually says to live properly. The King James says, have your conversation be honest. Now, the passage really does mean to live properly, but the Greek literally it could also be translated as have a beautiful life, right? Like, have such a beautiful life and have such a way of living that when people accuse you, they see your beautiful behavior. They see this awesome, commendable, admirable, excellent, surpassing, useful, suitable is what the word literally means in Greek. Live above it all. And so Peter is actually speaking to a group of people who have zero rights. He's telling them to live beautifully. Even though you have nothing on this earth, live in such a way that is absolutely beautiful. And let's be honest, you cannot live a beautiful life if you're constantly distracted by sin. Yeah, you might have a surface level of beauty because you've got all of the right stuff. But if we're worshiping all of the right stuff instead of Jesus, it could be killing our souls. See, the beautiful works aren't to show everybody how Instagram beautiful I am. It's not to get people's admiration and applause. But Peter's saying to the early church, he's saying, live a beautiful life to show that your life honors God. And so as we sit here in Restored Church, are you living a beautiful life that honors God? Is your community group, is your micro gathering, is it in pursuit of a beautiful life that honors God? Or is there a temporary understanding that you have adopted? Maybe you've not pursued a temporary sojourner mentality yet as a Jesus follower. Maybe the thing that's holding you back from spiritual growth is the surrender of something that you consider to be a permanent part of your identity. I completely understand what it's like to be in that space. We often start allowing things to be a part of our identity that aren't necessarily what Jesus has designed for us. And so for me, when I was in high school, my identity was built around my ability to play sports. And during a time of struggle and a time of hardship, I recognized that I needed to surrender my abilities in playing sports to Jesus. And God transformed everything that I thought my identity was built in as a result of doing so. During this season of COVID, what is the element that God is leaning into that He's raising up? And He's letting you know, hey, you need to watch out for this. The other thing I'm thinking about is we're thinking about living a life of that so that your unbelieving neighbors see how beautiful your life is. I think it's very important for us to recognize as Americans that we have a dual citizenship. We have a citizenship of heaven and we have a citizenship of the United States. And I don't know if you've noticed, but that citizenship of the United States is very polarized right now. What if the beautiful way that we live our life, because we're unique in the United States. Peter is writing to a group of people who have no rights. He's writing to a group of people and he's just going, hey, do your best. Make sure that you keep your reputation good. And so when people accuse you, they have nothing to point at. But we in the United States have so many rights. We are to steward those rights in unconditional love. Ladies and gentlemen, unconditional love should be impossible to offend. Unconditional love should be able to love our neighbor. A beautiful life as a dual citizen, we should be the ones that are able to hear our enemies, even if they are from an opposing point of view. We are the ones that should be rallying people together towards common interests, and we should be the ones that are reaching out to those people who have been hurt, and when we know that we could never bridge the gap if it wasn't for Jesus. The other thing I think that our ability right now, we have the ability to listen to those who we don't agree with, and we have to admit the non-Christian perspective in all arenas of politics. And above all, I hope that you're not resting your identity in a political party. I hope that through this election time that you will pursue that your identity is more to be known as a Jesus follower than any of the things that our world has to offer right now. And so as I was thinking, there's a couple action points I wanted us to point to from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. I think that Peter is encouraging his readers, please, please, please don't go back. And so for some of us, we need to understand an eternal perspective. We need to understand that we can't go back to whatever it was that we are called away from. And so maybe it is going back to the way we did life before COVID. I don't know. But I think for all of us, if we had a understanding of our temporariness before God, it could help us out. And one thing I was thinking about was maybe what you need to do is write like a little heartbeat in pen on your hand to remind you that we are designed for eternity, but we have a temporary job here on this earth. So develop an eternal perspective and remind yourself that this world is not our home. The next action point I'm thinking about is avoid sin, right? Peter says right here that we need to make sure that we are staying away from the worldly desires that wage war against our souls. And so for some of you, you've got to learn what that sin is. A few years ago, I did a personality test, and it actually said that I was a glutton. And I was like, have you seen me? I've been trying to gain weight my entire life. And he said, your sin isn't gluttony of food. Your sin is probably gluttony of experience. And thinking back on my life, I realized I think he was right. I spend a lot of my time just experiencing life, and I love adventure. And he said that what you can do is you can start feeding that desire for experience so much that you will actually miss the depth of relationship that your friends around you are offering, your family has to offer you. And so as we learn our sin, the other thing I would encourage you to do is make sure that you learn the soul issue behind the sin. You know, for me, the soul issue is that I'm not satisfied and I need to learn contentment. For some of us, we have our sin issue is that we want other people's stuff. We're breaking the 10th commandment by looking at Facebook and Instagram every single day. And we need to get to the spot where we recognize that, God, you've given me enough. For some of us, our sin issue is control. We think that if we can just grab enough control, that it allows us to make sure that there are no ducks out of order, and that we are making sure that everything in our life is 100% perfect. And we have to recognize that faith and surrender are a necessary part of getting to know Jesus a little bit better. For some of us, our sin issue is sin, is lying, or it's just anger, or there are many different areas that we are prone to be distracted, and those worldly things destroy our souls. And I want to encourage you, maybe we need to do a little bit of a deep dive and understand what our sin is. Maybe you know what your sin is because you've been dealing with it for all of COVID. My encouragement for you is that once you know what that sin is, make sure that you are creating some boundaries around yourself. Maybe you're like, well, I'm not really sure what my sin is. Ask somebody who's close to you, and I'm sure that they can give you a little bit of an insight on the thing that distracts you from God's purpose. Because that's what sin is. Sin is missing the mark. You will never find what God has designed you for here, right now, in this temporary space, if you're constantly distracted by sin. That's what Peter is telling the early church. The other thing I would encourage you to do is find a way to surrender your sin. If you're in a micro gathering or if you're in a community group, take some time and maybe you'll do something that is a campfire experience. And maybe you are laughing because that was a part of your experience growing up with camp, but that is a moment that you remember. Maybe what you want to do with your community group is go to a body of water and everybody scribble on a stone what their sin is and throw it into the water and remind themselves that God has separated us as far from the east is from the west, away from our sin. Maybe you need a tangible reminder that sin that you have been working on is no more. And so find a way that you can build up boundaries and remind yourself as a temporary resident, don't go back into that sin. Maybe your sin is comfort and you want to make sure that you have everything that you need for success. And maybe you need to start offering some things, maybe in this moment of surrender. Maybe you need to start getting rid of a few things in order to allow God to speak into your life. The last thing, the action point that I want to point us to in this passage is to live properly, to live a beautiful life in your community. Do you personally, do you have a reputation of living a beautiful life, or do you have if you have a reputation of living a selfish life? Is there something that you need to do in order to make your life beautiful? As we walk in the Spirit, we will start to live more beautiful lives, but some of us have never thought through living a life that is different, that is outside of the ordinary, that's proper, that is honorable in behavior. We think about that at church, but we don't think about that at home. Maybe you are starting to live an honorable, beautiful life, and then COVID hit and you're tempted to go back to not living that way. Maybe you have a relationship that you need to reconnect with or to mend, because in order to live a beautiful life, we are called to live in community. John 13:34 and 35 says, "By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, is by your love for one another." And it's a command. It's not an option. Here in the Northeast, a lot of churches have started, and people have literally stopped going from one church to another, and no conversation was had. And maybe this time of COVID, while everything's a little bit just different and there's a natural reset, you need to go back and apologize to somebody and reconnect with a relationship. As a Jesus follower, in order to live a life that's beautiful and that shows honor to God, we cannot do that if we are not in community with one another. And whether or not they're in the four walls of the church or not, a lot of us have some relationships that are a little bit more distant that we need to mend and build and reconnect with in order to build the entire body of believers in the Northeast. So maybe you've got to go connect a relationship. And then the other thing I was thinking about is, in order to live beautiful lives that honor God, maybe I want to ask you if your micro gathering or community group is beautiful to the community that you gather in. Do the people in the community of the micro gatherings, of the community groups, look at that and go, man, those people are so nice. I can't believe all the great things that they are doing. So maybe you got to do something real tangible. Maybe you need to pick up the garbage in the community where you're just parking your cars. Maybe you want to put together we're thinking of you and we care about you baskets, and you just give them out to a couple houses that are around where you gather for your community groups or for your micro gatherings. And may we be known as people who are living beautiful lives, and that when people accuse us of doing wrong, the people that are closest to us go, oh, those guys? No. They're pretty amazing groups of people. This should be a focus for us as we continue to pursue Jesus. So Peter is writing to his Jewish Christian friends who have been scattered throughout the early world and telling them, don't go back to the way you were formerly living, but live temporary foreign lives where we are light and we're agile and we're ready to move. Don't get bogged down with sin, but make sure that we are living in such an honorable way that the people around us know that God is doing something in our midst. And so as we close out and we are going into the spiritual discussion guides, I want to encourage you, what are some ways that you need to shift your life in order to live a more beautiful life that honors God? Maybe it's to get rid of sin. Maybe it's to start living a little bit more of a sojourner life and less of a permanent dwelling. And maybe we need to lean into what Jesus is trying to get our attention in COVID through. So thanks for listening, and let me close this in a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you that this world is not our purpose. But God, thank you that you've designed a purpose for each of us through our passage here in this world. And so God, I just pray that we would recognize that our role in life, our goal in life is not to seek comfort and not to seek the easiest way to get through. But Lord, our role is to communicate God's love. God, I pray that if any of us have relationships that we need to mend, whether they're at Restored or at other churches that are of Jesus followers, I pray that today that we will pick up the phone and make the phone call. And Lord, I just pray that we would be known as people who live beautiful lives. And Jesus, as we live those beautiful lives, may that be the beginning of the revival here in the Northeast. God, our world is desperately seeking answers. May the way we live our lives be attractive and unbelievably beautiful as we reflect the love of Jesus to those who are around us. So Jesus, thank you for our time today, and I pray that you would use us beyond our capacity. And it's in your name I pray. Amen.
watch and pray. Find in me thine all in all. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Lord, now indeed I find thy power and thine alone can change the leper's thoughts and melt this heart of stone. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand in him complete, Jesus died my soul to save. My lips shall still repeat, Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Oh, praise the one who paid my debt and raised this life up from the dead. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. Sin had left a crimson stain, he washed it white as snow.
Well, that was a great message. Hope we can all benefit from that this week. If you want to keep talking about this with your community group, with your micro gathering, maybe with your friends or family or neighbors, you can do that. We have a guide to help you. You don't have to do it on your own. If you go to restoredchurch.org/talk, we'll have a guide there with questions to help you get those conversations rolling. If you're interested in partnering with us here at Restored Church, you can do that online. You can give to us at restoredchurch.org/give, or you can mail a physical paper check to Restored Church, 74 South Meade Street, Wilkes-Barre, PA, 18702. We appreciate your generosity in helping us to see every man, woman, and child reached with the gospel here in Wilkes-Barre. So, hope you guys have a blessed week. Thank you again for joining us, and God bless you.